Welcome everyone to SumZero again. Today we've got Brian Finn, the #1 ranked healthcare analyst on SumZero as of today. Been on SumZero for a very long time and has built quite a reputation for himself. Runs a fund called Findell Capital. And today we're going to be talking about ticker ESTA, which is a breast implant manufacturer based out of Costa Rica, roughly a $1 billion market cap. Definitely not something that you're going to be hearing about through mainstream media at all, but exactly the kind of stuff that we love on SumZero. Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for having me. I can I guess start off with kind of like the high level thesis here, which is ESTA is a company based out of Costa Rica. Not a lot of people have heard of it outside of the medtech space. But what these guys have is the best in class implant called Motiva, and it's a step change better product than what currently exists from a safety perspective. And we'll get into what that means. In addition to that, they've got this new procedure they've developed called MiaFemTech, and this could also really revolutionize the way breast augmentation works in the future. And this could really be kind of a new thing in plastic surgery, like a new sort of a Ozempic-like product for women. And the reason why the story is interesting now is basically this is a company that, it started in Costa Rica. They first launched in kind of the Latin American markets and then in Asia and Europe. And they're just about to get clearance to launch in the US. The FDA just gave them a conditional approval a couple of weeks ago, pending a plant inspection, which should occur some point, this month or early July. And then we should see that final FDA clearance at some point, kind of late July, maybe early August. And then they're going to launch this product in the US, which is more or less half the global market for breast implants. And in addition to that, they've just started to ramp up their MiaFemTech procedure. And so that's going to start to kind of ramp up during the course of this year. They'll have about 100 of those open by the end of 2024. And this is a pretty interesting time to be getting in because the stock is sold off about 25%. Not really clear why, but it's come down a bit. And you've got an enormous amount of short interest in this name. About 20% of the float is short. And we can kind of get into sort of our theories on why folks are shorted. But, over the next couple of months, we're going to see these guys launch in the US. They're going to roll out MiaFemTech. And we'll have some proof points of their success therein, with US sales numbers and, the MiaFemTech numbers as well. And we'll get into why those are why the Motiva product is a very compelling product and why MiaFemTech is also a very, very compelling product and solution for women, looking to do an augmentation.
So Brian, just to set the backdrop a little bit, can you maybe quantify how big the breast augmentation market is?
Globally, this is about, a $2 billion market for, reconstruction and aesthetics. And that number kind of can vary depending on who you're talking to. The history of breast implants is interesting. The first one happened in the early 1960s, and they started out with what were called smooth implants. Now, about 20 years after that, you started to see some lawsuits occur. And this happened because you were getting inflammatory responses. And what you saw were women getting these things called capsular contractures, which is where the muscle tissue kind of sort of contracts over the implant. And they were also getting ruptures. And when these two things happen, you have to get a reoperation. And you saw a bunch of lawsuits around these issues. It went on to kind of bankrupt some of the early breast implant makers. And then you saw a switch from what were called smooth implants to textured implants. And those started to come about kind of in the 90s. And the idea was that the texture of the implant would diminish the inflammatory response. And you saw that. There were lower rates of capsular contracture and rupture. But then you started to see cancer become a risk with the textured implants. And you saw some cases of cancer occur. And these are still relatively rare, like 1 in 10,000 cases of a textured implant causing cancer. But the textured implants basically were Allergan recalled its textured implant from the US market, and the US is now back to being a smooth market. I think this is all important to talk about because, when you think of a company in the med tech space coming out of Costa Rica, it's a very sort of unusual story. And I think part of maybe what's held people back from investing in this stock is the sense that, this is a Costa Rican company, and maybe there's some negative prejudice towards sort of the country of origin here, because people think of Costa Rica as being, a vacation destination, not a place at the cutting edge of medical technology. But Costa Rica has been, for the last couple of decades, a manufacturing hub for a lot of these medtech device companies. And the way ESTA started was you essentially had a bunch of medtech companies operating in this business park down there. And Allergan, which is one of the two main companies in the breast implant space, had a big facility, and they had a bunch of engineers, and they were producing all of Allergan's breast implants down there. A couple of these engineers, a guy by the name of Roberto and another fellow named Salvador, went to the leadership of Allergan in the early 2000s, and they had some ideas for how to improve the breast implant that they were making. But they were basically told to pound sand. The leadership there, having dealt with all this litigation and just all the agitas around the space. There had been a moratorium put in place by the FDA for silicone breast implants a couple decades ago. They weren't interested in trying to innovate or develop this category. They were just kind of running it as a cash cow. So these guys went and they found a local entrepreneur who had a company called Establishment Labs that he incorporated, that he was using to distribute breast implants. And they partnered with this guy, and he basically kind of helped them, gave them the money to do the R&D to come up with a better product here. And what these guys had figured out was that the issue with breast implants was not really whether it was textured or smooth. That what you really had to think about was a concept called roughness. There was sort of a right amount of roughness that basically wouldn't trigger the inflammatory response and wouldn't trigger the cancer response. And so they came up with basically a 4-micron type of surface. And this surface essentially solved for sort of both sets of complications, the complications that the smooth implants have and the complications that the textured implants have. And this was all later validated. There was a lab at MIT run by a guy named Robert Langer. They did a study where they looked at this at kind of a molecular level, and kind of affirmed the thesis that these two engineers had, which was that roughness is what kind of determines the outcomes here for breast implants. So we talk about that in our write-up. So these guys, they come up with this breast implant, and they launch it first in Costa Rica and some Latin American markets, and then later in Europe and Asia. And they've been taking market share ever since. What their the original premise, sort of the scientific premise of why this was a superior product was validated, with the real world experience. They had a much lower rate of capsular contracture and rupture, basically less than 1%. Their competitors had rates that were 15 to 30%. So, if you look at like an Allergan product, you, after 10 years, have a 70% chance of needing a reoperation on that product for either capsular contracture, rupture, or other issues that may arise. For an ESTA product, it's high single digits. So they really developed a product that was an order of magnitude better than what was out there. And so they've been launching this product, and it's been launched in a bunch of markets abroad, but has yet to be launched in the US, which is by far kind of the biggest market here.
Brian, what is their current market share versus the two other big players?
Well, there's 0% in the US, 15% abroad. And that's gone, that's doubled over the last 4 years. So, our thesis here is to get to about at least 30% internationally and 30% in the US. And that's enough, for the stock to be worth like $150 a share, just on that sort of market share gain for those two markets.
What are their current sales?
They're doing about 200 million. Well, that's sort of roughly what I mean, this year it's the guidance is for, 168 to 180-ish. It's sort of in the 170 range, but we think they'll end up be doing about 200 million this year.
Got it. So on the product itself, it sounds like it's still a silicone implant. It's just the way it's manufactured, the surface of it has a different texture than the competitors. Am I hearing that correctly?
Correct. Yeah.
Do you worry at all about, Allergan and some of the other big names essentially copying the manufacturing process, to achieve that 4-micron detail you mentioned earlier, part of their patent program? Like, what's
no, I mean, like they've got tons of patent protection on what they're doing, and Allergan and Johnson & Johnson haven't had any interest in investing in this space for a very long period of time. I mean, these are big companies. The breast implants niche is important in the sense that it is, they sell a suite of products to the plastic surgeons. And so it's important that they have some product out there, but they're very gun shy about innovating in this space or spending any time in this space, given what's happened from a litigation perspective in the past.
You mentioned the $150 target price. What is the, valuation framework you're using here to get to that number?
So, we looked at it if you look at sort of a mature medtech company, what their typical margins are, 25 to 30% EBITDA margins, and that's kind of been corroborated by our discussions with the management team. But basically, we think they're going to launch in the US in short order. And what we talked about in our presentation, where we came up with kind of differentiated research here is we were able to get distributor data from the two markets that are most alike the US, and that's South Korea and Switzerland. The reason why these two markets are most similar to the US is they're markets where you have a high GDP per capita, and they're smooth markets as opposed to textured markets. Again, the US switched back to being a smooth market because of the breast cancer risk. Some countries like Brazil, sort of Latin American countries, are still textured markets. So, and these are also markets that focus a lot on safety. And the distributor data showed that, ESTA comes in, and within 4 or 5 years, despite having a product that's 30% more expensive than the competitive products, and these were both markets that were dominated by Allergan and Johnson & Johnson, ESTA took majority market share, within 5 years. And today they're, well north of 50% in both of these markets. This is these are both very compelling kind of case studies in how ESTA will likely succeed in the US market. And we're not assuming in our model, in our valuation, that they get to 60, 70%. We assume they get to like 30%, which is still enough to drive a multiple higher here in the stock price. The important thing is that their gross margins in the US and China, they just launched in China late last year, will improve a bunch because the average sales price in these two markets is much higher than what it is in other countries that they sell to. So you should see about 500 to 800 bips of gross margin expansion. They're roughly 65% gross margin now, so we assume they get to like 72%. And then we assume, relatively robust growth in the US to get to like about 30% at our terminal year value, and then roughly 30% market share abroad. And that gets us to about $150 a share for just the valuation of Motiva, and not MiaFemTech. But I think, one of the reasons why folks have looked at this story and been a little bit skeptical is, I think, one, sort of the Costa Rica origin story that might throw some people off, because you don't see many companies come out of a place like Costa Rica. Two, you've got a lot of folks who are just kind of skeptical of the data here, and they talk to a lot of folks who are plastic surgeons and the like, and the US plastic surgeons are there's basically three guys that folks talk to on these GLG calls who tend to be older plastic surgeons who are sort of wed to the Allergan Johnson & Johnson product suite. And so they'll say things like, we don't need another product. We're fine with kind of what we currently have. And, they're a little bit skeptical of the data here. And there was, and we talk about in our report, there was a short report by Hindenburg that called out the data that these guys had. And, we go through and we refute Hindenburg's claims, but the reality is that these guys at this point, they've been on the market now abroad for more than 10 years. So they've got lots of their own sort of self-reported data, which shows capsular contracture and rupture rates of less than 1%. They've got several independent studies. The one that they kind of most conclusively cite is the Sforza study, which was out of London, which involved, dozens of centers and dozens of surgeons, and again, showed a capsular contracture and rupture rate of less than 1%. They've got 4-year FDA data, which again shows capsular contracture rupture rate of less than 1%. And they've got warranty data. So, there's an incentive for patients to self-report issues with their breast implants. And again, their warranty data lines up with the independent study data, the FDA data, and their self-reported data. So the question marks that people have on the data side of things here are, I think going to be look increasingly silly. And as these guys, as their FDA study matures, and you start to see 5-year data, 6-year data, 7-year data, every year that will remind people about how much differentiated their product is versus the competitors. What you're seeing right now in their 4-year data is not a big increase in any of these, and their capsular contracture and rupture rate stayed the same basically from the prior year data. And it looks like it's just kind of flattening out here. And you typically see most of those issues occur in the first 2 years. So every year will be a reminder of how much better their product is. It's a step change better product than what Johnson & Johnson and Allergan have. And we think that over time, you'll see plastic surgeons, almost not have a choice, but to use sort of the safe product. And that's been the case in South Korea and Switzerland. The US is obviously a very litigious market. And we think, you could see over time lawsuits start to occur as folks still get, the legacy products used and end up kind of having issues with those products that could have been avoided had they used, Motiva or an Establishment Labs product. So we think, a lot of guys who've looked at the name, they're speaking to kind of the wrong KOLs. If you talk to younger plastic surgeons, or you do sort of a broader look at the bigger universe of plastic surgeons out there, you'll see much more different feedback than. We've definitely gotten very, very positive feedback from the younger plastic surgeons who are really excited to have this product on the market. One of them.
You mentioned July as your expected timeframe for FDA approval. How confident are you that happens?
Well, they essentially got a conditional approval, and they said in that announcement, this was in early June, that they would have an inspection within 30 days. And I don't want to say that's a check the box type of risk, but I'm not too worried that they don't pass that inspection, that plant inspection. They've had other agencies check that plant out. It's a state-of-the-art plant. They've actually gone down there and seen it. It's this whole medical center they have outside of San Jose has several. A lot of the big medtech companies have their manufacturing facilities there. Again, as I mentioned, Allergan was down there, but you have like Smith and Nephew and a few other ones that are there. So you get past that event, and then I think they come to market, sometime, or they get the clearance sometime in July and probably come to market shortly thereafter. And I do think there'll be a lot of folks who will be buying kind of in the aftermath of this company being able to have that seal of approval, because medtech investors are not necessarily people that want to take FDA risk or approval risk, but I think people will be happy to take kind of the commercialization risk here.
Yeah, and speaking to that, what is their go-to-market plan in the US? Like, how do they sort of like advertise to plastic surgeons and make it known that their rupture rates are much lower than that of their competitors? And because I think the point you made earlier, where if they're if the implants effectively last much longer with their products versus other products, you would almost be negligent to not use their products if you're a plastic surgeon. So, but how do they kind of spread the word on that? How quickly do you expect that word to spread?
I mean, I've talked to several plastic surgeons who say that they're incredibly excited about Motiva coming to market. They hired Allergan's former head of US sales as their sort of chief sales guy in the US. So, I'm sure he'll build out a sales team of some sort. And a lot of surgeons are aware of the product. They do have a great sort of Instagram, social media presence. And, it's the first real new product that has been in the space in a long time. And that was sort of the feedback I got from a lot of plastic surgeons, which was, we've been using the same products here for like the last several decades. This is the first new product. Now it's going to be more expensive than what's currently on the market, but it should just, there should be a lot of folks that will kind of glob onto it. There are folks that have sort of really strong relationships with Allergan or Johnson & Johnson. They get paid speaking fees, or they're on some sort of special committee with some of these companies, and so it might be harder to peel away some of those guys. But in the end, they kind of won't have a choice, because as one surgeon told me, I mean, this is the first product that people actually ask for, that people are aware of. They're aware of the safety difference, and they'll actually ask for it. That's not really for most situations in the medtech space. People aren't asking for specific medtech products. People don't go in to get a breast augmentation, ask for a specific type of implant, but they are with Motiva.
Yeah, it sounds like demand is building. Now, we actually got an interesting question. Who bears the cost of a rupture or, like a reoperation situation? And also, what is the warranty associated with the implants? And those two relate.
The surgeon will bear that cost, and then the company will have to, issue a new implant. But before I want to start talking about Mia, because I think we spent all day talking about Motiva, and I think the report does a good job of outlining the data there, and why we think the US will be an easy market to penetrate. But what's interesting about ESTA is that there's really multiple legs of growth to this story. The first leg that we talk about in the report is them expanding into the US. And what that means, once they have FDA clearance, that should also re-engineer growth abroad, because there are a lot of doctors abroad that won't use a non-FDA cleared product. So it'll be beneficial for their outside the US sales, and obviously it'll start this whole new sort of sales engine within the US. But beyond Motiva, the second leg of this growth story is going to be Mia. And Mia, I think, is kind of the most interesting thing about this company, because they've developed really kind of the first of its kind sort of minimally invasive procedure that kind of solves for a lot of the issues that women have with breast implants. The reason why a woman wouldn't do a breast implant is because it's an arduous thing to do to your body. You've got like a long recovery time. It's painful. It's a long surgery. You have to go under anesthesia. And for a lot of women, they don't like the aesthetic. Breast implants can look pretty ridiculous sometimes, especially if you're like a professional woman in, call it like sort of a blue city, like a Boston, a New York, a San Francisco. You might want to do something to enhance your aesthetic there, but you're not going to necessarily want to go from like a B cup to a double D cup. So what these guys came up with was a procedure called MiaFemTech, and their basically they're going to expand this with partnerships with plastic surgeons where they create MiaFemTech dedicated centers. And the benefits of MiaFemTech are really multiple. For the surgeon, they can do multiple surgeries because the surgeries only take about 15 minutes. They're very, very easy to do. So they can do way more surgeries during the course of a day. So that's way more revenue for the surgeon. And it's a way sort of simpler process. And for the patient, it achieves a much better aesthetic look with none of the risks and none of the downtime that a more typical surgery would require. And we went down to Costa Rica, one of their first Mia centers, and we saw these surgeries get performed. And it's remarkable. You got to see it to believe it. It's remarkable how different these procedures are from a regular breast implant. I mean, a regular breast implant's very, I don't want to use the term bloody, but they're gruesome to watch. And it all looks fine in the end, and they work. But this was a much more bloodless procedure. It looked like, you know, an 8-year-old could do it. What they developed here were a few things. So they developed basically a device that can gun the breast in. So the surgeon makes a very small incision, and then they slip this gun in, and then they're able to gun the breast in. So the implant it's formed in such a way where it can reform quickly, and it's a much smaller shape, but it's able to achieve more of a protrusion and a better look. And it looks just way more natural than other breast implants. And a report kind of goes through how sort of the different innovations that they came up with. One of the critiques from the Hindenburg short report, which we thought was very silly, was that this sort of procedure has existed before, and that's just not the case. I mean, you've had procedures that didn't require general anesthesia in the breast implant space, but nothing that's at all akin to what Mia is. The Mia procedure does not involve really cutting through a lot of the same tissue that a normal breast implant would require. And it's achieving a different look with, you know, again, no recovery time, or very minimum recovery time. And the procedure itself is super quick and seamless. And we talked to, there was a woman down there who was a relatively high profile woman in the finance space. And we caught up with her, you know, a couple of months later. And her testimony we thought was incredibly compelling. And if this, you know, when this product gets launched in the US, this will be sort of a viral thing that tons of women will eventually kind of come to get. Because what she told us was that, you know, she wasn't the type of person that wanted to get a big, silly implant. And, you know, she looked at breast implants as being not at all something that she was interested in doing. But she'd gotten older. She was working out a lot. Her breast tissue had gotten hardened a bit, so there was sort of more muscle there. And she wanted to do something to improve the aesthetic. And Mia really offered her a way of doing that. And she was able to get, you know, no one can tell that it's actually a breast implant. It just, her body just looks like it's shaped better. And that's, you know, that's what Mia can do. And we think that could potentially be revolutionary, especially as we enter a world where you do see a lot of women take things like Ozempic and lose a lot of weight suddenly. And, you know, that can lead to sort of misshapen breasts. And so Mia could be a solution for that. So we think Mia really represents an extraordinary potential sort of growth vector for ESTA that they really haven't talked a lot about. You know, they've started opening these centers up. There are a couple dozen that are in existence today. They are projecting to be able to do about $1 million in revenue to ESTA per center per year. They're expected to have about 100 of these centers open by the end of this year. And, you know, we modeled it out and thought that they could maybe get, let's say, you know, 50 to 70 centers a year for the next several years. But, you know, if you got out to 2029 and they've got 350 of these centers going, doing roughly 350 million in revenue, I mean, that's a huge incremental margin to that business.
Does it cannibalize their Motiva product in the long run? What's the relationship between the two products in the long run?
You know, we think it expands the market. I mean, these are a lot of women that wouldn't go do a big breast implant. it could ultimately cannibalize some breast implant sales, but they own, their average sales price for MiaFemTech is much higher than what it would be for Motiva. And we think ultimately just kind of expands the market for breast aesthetics.
And I'm assuming it would also require FDA approval. Any idea what the timeline of that could be? Do they talk about that?
That would be a supplement to their. So if they got cleared in July here, then that could be something that they do under a supplement to that approval.
Interesting. Very cool. So in terms of catalyst, it sounds like July is the big one. Are there others that you've got that you're kind of looking out for?
Well, we think, they'll launch in the US. There's a ton of short interest here, so I think that'll clear out some of the short interest, and then we'll start to see US sales numbers and Mia sales numbers here, over the next, call it Q4, Q1 of next year, and that'll be sort of a proof point of this sort of longer term growth story.
Yeah. Has Hindenburg, have they updated any of their talking points? I think that report about a year and a half ago, or I guess a lot's happened since then, but have they said anything in terms of changes to their own thesis?
Not that we're aware of. I mean, they put this out, I think, in October of 2022. Again, their critique of the data didn't make much sense. They were really kind of calling into question the fact that a lot of the authors of these different data sets had ties to the industry, and that's just the reality of the medtech space. I mean, every single medtech company, when they do these studies, I mean, these are products that doctors are using in the real world. You're going to have folks that have ties to companies in the field. So that just kind of was reflective of not understanding how the medtech space works. This is different from like a pharmaceutical product in that respect. And at this point, I mean, they've had the FDA data is a lot more mature than it was 2 years ago. And that has obviously reaffirmed what their other data sets. The other thing that these guys, I mean, they pointed out two things that were worth responding to and that were interesting. One was the history of Sientra. Again, the breast implant market's been dominated by Johnson & Johnson and Allergan. There was a company called Sientra that entered the space back in the early 2010s. They started gaining market share, and then they stalled, and they actually eventually went bankrupt. Sientra on the surface looks like a similar story to ESTA, but there's a couple of key differences here that are sort of important to note. But Sientra was not a new breast technology, a new breast implant technology. It was an older Brazilian breast implant that this company had bought. Sientra was a distributor company, and they bought this Brazilian breast implant, and they did a study, and the study showed results that were, slightly better than what Allergan and Johnson & Johnson had, but not the step change function better. I mean, we're talking about a 10% capsular contracture rupture rate versus 15 to 20, whereas ESTA is 1%. But as they were launching this product, and they were gaining share initially, Sientra had a product recall because they had some particulate matter in their breast implant, and their plant blew up, and they were never able to recover from these two events. So we don't think this is at all analogous to what ESTA is going to experience when they launch in the US. The other issue that Hindenburg brought up was the fact that the ESTA breast implants tend to drop, and that is actually true. And by dropping, it means that they fall sort of from the pocket that the surgeon creates. That tends to happen at a higher rate with ESTA breast implants, but that's actually kind of a feature, not a bug. These breast implants, because they're constructed in a way that minimizes capsular contracture and minimizes sort of tissue overgrowth, they have to be put in much smaller pockets than a normal breast implant. And so some surgeons will create too big of a pocket, and you'll see the breast implant drop. So this really isn't an issue with Motiva per se, it's an issue with the surgeons. ESTA's created a very safe implant, and sometimes the surgeons will botch a surgery, and that's always going to be a risk with any implant. But that's, blaming the company that makes the implant for that is like blaming a car company that makes a car that a bad driver crashes. So, we don't think that that's really a long-term issue with ESTA. And generally speaking, the surgeons that have experienced that issue tend to not repeat the mistake, once they've made it. But ESTA obviously gives all the correct educational background to these surgeons to make sure they don't make that mistake.
What's the financial health of the company right now, just in terms of cash flows, balance sheet? Is it a profitable business today, or are they burning cash right now? What's the situation look like?
They're profitable if you look at their outside the US business and non-MiaFemTech. They're investing in those, they're investing in the US launch, they're investing in MiaFemTech. So, today they're still burning cash. They expect to get to some sort of EBITDA profitability towards the end of this year. They did an equity raise early this past year, or sorry, late last year. So there was kind of a balance sheet overhang that was hurting the stock, which was part of the reason why the stock sold off so much late last year. What happened late last year was that they saw some softness in the overall macro environment for their product. They were still growing sales, but they weren't growing at like a 30 to 40% CAGR that they had grown in the past. And that was because the whole market had shrunk by like 15-20% that year, because there had been a big COVID kind of hangover from the overspend in the past. So they still grew, but they didn't grow at the rate that they had expected, and they were a little overstretched on their balance sheet. And so the stock got crushed, but they had since they did a small equity raise. They took out a lot of the SG&A and took out some of the extra costs. The macro environment's gotten better, it's improved, and now we're on the cusp of this US approval. So we think once we get past the US approval, this is a stock that should be in the $60 to $70 range, and then go up from there as they prove out their ability to commercialize in the US.
Super interesting. Just on risks, if they don't get approval, kind of what's your reaction function, going to be? And do you think it's a situation where that maybe they don't get it in July, but it gets punted a couple months? And of course, what are the other risks?
They've already essentially gotten a conditional approval. So if they were to have an issue with the plant, so the approval process is very de-risked at this point. Everything else, like all their data, everything else they've submitted has been accepted. It's just pending a plant inspection. So you could end up with a complete response letter or some sort of response to the plant where they cite an issue or two, and then they would just correct that issue. They've done a lot of, obviously, test runs with former FDA officials to understand what people would point out, and they've, I'm sure there have been learnings there. So I think they're well prepared for this plant inspection. But I don't really view they're going to get to the US market, at some point this year. And I think this conditional approval that they got earlier in June really de-risks that. Now, could they get delayed a bit because of something happens with the plant inspection? I mean, this plant inspection was supposed to happen in early June, but the inspector got sick. Does that happen again? Is there a volcano in Costa Rica? I don't know. But they'll get to market in the US. The risk here is obviously that they don't take the market share that we think that they're going to take. But even then, I mean, if you just assume that they continue to grow abroad at a certain rate, and that their SG&A stays, they keep their SG&A in line here, which they think they can do. The downside from here is still relatively de minimis. We think that,
So you mentioned, MiaFemTech is kind of another
back in the macro environment.
So outside of MiaFemTech, are there any other growth opportunities that you wanted to highlight?
The last one, which we think is interesting, is GEM. And we talk about it in our report. So we talk about the 3 pillars of growth here. The first being their launch in the US, the second being MiaFemTech, and the third being GEM. And that's their gluteal implant. So if you look at that market, the Brazilian butt lift market, It's one of these markets has grown a lot over the last 10 years. It started obviously in Brazil. It's grown a lot in the US. We looked at different market data sources, and it's almost, some would say almost $2 billion. So it's starting to rival the breast implant market. It's a market that involves a procedure that's very, very dangerous. I mean, literally, there's like 0.3 to 0.6% of the people that get this procedure done end up dying, because what it does is it involves taking sort of pieces of fat, sticking in your buttocks, and that fat can get dislodged and end up in your circulatory system and cause a pulmonary embolism. ESTA has developed, using their MiaFemTech approach, they developed a solution for the augmentation market that involves using their MiaFemTech, their injector approach, to inject an implant into the buttocks that could end up, being a solution here for people, as opposed to doing the BBL. And we include in our report a before and after picture showing what that could look like. We don't assume any valuation for that procedure because it's not yet commercialized. We think it likely gets commercialized at some point late 2025, but that would be the third pillar of growth here.
It's fascinating. Brian, this is great. I'll be certainly looking out for that July announcement. If there's anything else you want to add, feel free. I think it's an interesting story, just for me at least, because there's the Costa Rica angle. I mean, I feel like it's probably off most people's radars, but the sort of global appeal of it, I think, is pretty obvious. And so I think if they can gain traction in the US, I mean, if anything, that's a great signal for bigger global expansion plans that I'm sure they have. But is there anything else that you feel like we've missed that you'd like to add?
No, look, I think it's an opportune time to be buying this, just because we're on the cusp of this approval. The stock traded off a bit. Maybe there was our theories, maybe there was some options activity, and with the June expiry, and folks were buying call options with an approval in mind. And then there was some sell the news when they got the conditional approval. Hard to say, but we think once they actually come to market here, there'll be a whole new suite of buyers in the medtech sort of investing community, and this will be a secular grower for the next dozen or so years. And I think especially in recessions, when everyone's, these guys are going to be capturing market share and growing in a recession, and this will be the sort of story you want to own into a recession, we think.
Can you explain that a little bit? What is it about recessions that make it, an attractive stock?
Well, just, when you enter a recession, people will look for stocks that can grow in a recession. Those will tend to fall the least and recover the quickest. And given the new markets that ESTA is going to be launching into, and the new sort of product categories with Mia and Gem, we think that ESTA will grow sort of regardless over the next 10 years.
That makes sense. Brian, this has been great. Thanks for talking about it. We'll certainly be tracking it, and hopefully we'll get a chance to follow up on it at some point in the future as well.
All right. Thank you, Divya.